Around 3 months ago, I set up this naturalistic enclosure for my sister's leopard gecko. To make it, I started with a custom background that I carved, painted, and installed in the tank. I then added substrate, plants, and wood, and that completed the build. Not only do I think I can make something much better, but the substrate I used also brought up an impaction risk. I'll talk about that more later. I'm going to be remaking it into something that looks and functions a lot better. I started by removing all the plants and then the substrate. The background itself looks pretty good. It's more of the hides that I have a problem with. They don't blend as well as I wanted them to, and they're very flat. I'll be using a very different technique later on in the video that I'm very excited about. While I'm dismantling this, I want to take a second to apologize for not posting as much. As some of you will know, I recently decided to move my animals to my basement. It was getting really hard to work on projects as I was so limited by space. For that reason also, I wasn't able to work on a lot of the projects I wanted to. Now that I have a dedicated room for this stuff and more space, I can finally start to work on some better projects. I also said that I was going to post the whole process in shorts, and I am still. However, I'm just going to do it a bit differently. I was originally going to post it in 2 to 3 parts where I explain everything that I'm doing, but instead I think I'm just going to post one of a time lapse. Anyway, after dismantling everything and cleaning it up, I realized that the glass on the bottom was cracked. I'm not sure how this happened, but since this tank won't be holding any water and nothing heavy, it's okay to seal it up with silicone. I applied it along all the cracks on the bottom. Then after applying the silicone, I smoothed it out with my finger to make sure it got in all the cracks. With that addressed, it's time to get back to cleaning the tank. I started by removing all the excess silicone from the background with a razor scraper. This was pretty easy to do, but there was quite a bit of it, so it did take some time. I eventually got it all off though, and then used some isopropyl alcohol to finish cleaning off the glass. Once everything was cleaned up, I started to add the egg crate back. Like the last one, I added this small layer of egg crate to act as a false bottom. There's only going to be succulents in here, but they still will be watered every once in a while. Now it's time to make the hides. For this I'll be using excavator clay. I had this in mind from the very beginning and I was very excited to try it out. I started by pouring it into a bucket and then adding water accordingly. Then I started to mix everything together. After thoroughly mixing everything, I laid down a piece of mesh to separate the clay from the false bottom. I also added this small plastic container. You'll see what that's for later. My original plan was to cover the entire bottom with clay, then add a layer of silicone, and top everything off with some sand. As I mentioned earlier, the previous substrate I was using had a high risk of impaction. This was the best thing I could think of at the time, but it didn't end up working out. Leopard gecko substrate is a very controversial topic, and it's hard to get a straight answer on things. At the time we thought cocoa fiber was alright, but over time it can cause impaction. I'll get more into that later though. You'll see here that I have some plastic pots around the enclosure. These will act as hides as well as an area for me to build the clay up onto. The clay is not strong enough by itself to hold itself up, so something like these pots will keep it from crumbling down. My idea here was to create 3 separate hides around the enclosure, with the right one having access to the top. This will be used as a basking spot. I was getting worried about the amount of clay I had at this point, so I added a piece of Oko Dragonstone near the back to help bulk things up a bit. You can also see that I added a few small plant pots on the hides. At this point I was feeling like the texture of the clay just wasn't what I wanted, so I sprayed it down and used my finger to press some texture into it. I did this to all 3 hides. I also started to dig out some more areas on the bottom for some more plant pots. Looking back, I probably didn't need to add pots to these. Anyway, after adding those, I was finally done with the clay. I think it looks much better than the original foam technique. After letting the clay dry for a few days, I started to add silicone to the bottom layer. As I mentioned earlier, the original plan was to add silicone to the bottom of the tank and then top it with sand. However, this didn't end up working. I'm not exactly sure why it didn't work. I've seen a number of people use this technique and they've seemed to have pretty good success with it. I've used it a few times in the past and I've never once got it to work. I'm not sure if I'm doing something wrong or if this technique just isn't the best. I used a brush to evenly distribute all the silicone on the bottom, then I poured sand on everything and patted it down. As I said, this technique didn't end up working, so it was time to start searching for an alternative. Fortunately, calcium sand was the answer. Regular sand is composed of tiny rocks that can eventually lead to impaction. However, calcium sand is made of calcium carbonate, which they can absorb. I would have preferred to use something a little more orange, but at the time this was all I could find. In addition to adding it to the bottom, I also added it on top of each hide, as well as inside the pots. With the substrate issue fixed, it's time to add the plants. As I said earlier, I'm using exclusively succulents. You know the drill by now. I started by removing the plants from the pots and breaking up the soil from the roots. I didn't film it, but I also took them outside and washed off any excess soil with the hose. Anyway, after prepping all the plants, I started to add them to the enclosure. Succulents are the perfect and ideal option for any arid enclosure. They prefer really low humidity, and they only need to be watered about once a month. Air plants are another good option, but I always have trouble finding them. After adding all the plants, I felt it was looking a bit bare, so I added a few pieces of weathered spiderwood. I'll hold them down with some superglue. I originally wasn't intending on adding any driftwood to this setup, but I'm really glad I did. I think it adds a lot, and it looks really good. Unfortunately, I lost the footage, but the hide in the middle where the plastic container is supposed to be the humid hide. I tied some sphagnum moss inside of a piece of mesh, then put it in there, and added some water. The moss will absorb water over time and help keep it humid for longer. The ARID leopard gecko enclosure version 2. I think this is a massive upgrade from the last one. Not only in terms of looks, but also functionality. Everything looks a lot more natural, and it all blends better. That was the biggest issue I had with the last one. As I said, all the hides and areas like that felt super flat. Everything looked very unnatural and man-made. I originally thought that the color of the sand didn't go well with the clay, but it's starting to grow on me. What do you think? Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know what you think about this build down in the comments. See ya!